All right, hello and welcome to Online History with Mr. G. Today we're asking the question, how much money was American sovereignty worth after the American and French revolutions? And we're looking at it in terms of real dollars because it's actually going to be tested. So as I erase our guiding question, be thinking about, what does that even mean? Like, what does it mean to put a dollar amount on something like sovereignty? And I think before we get into it, it's important to define terms. So sovereignty, the word actually means basically the ability to rule one's self or oneself. It's misused, in my opinion, if you're using it not speaking about a country. So do I have the sovereignty to walk down the street? Okay, we could talk about that. It's not really a fair use of the word, though. The word is more appropriately used in terms of discussing what one country is able to do versus another country. Does Denmark have the sovereignty to allow its citizens to have freedom of speech? Does Sweden have the sovereignty to restrict freedom of speech within its own borders? That's what sovereignty more commonly means and more correctly means. So when we're asking, how much was American sovereignty worth? What we're saying is, how much money is the independence of the United States actually worth, and the ability for it to say and do what it wants within its own borders? How much is that actually worth? Because it's going to be tested. Now, the American Revolution ends 1783. This is the Treaty of Paris. There's an S there. Treaty of Paris. Okay, 1783. 1797 is when this sovereignty is going to be given a dollar value. And that's why we're asking this question today. 1797, it's given a dollar value in what's known as the Xyz Affair. I apologize, it's a little difficult to see, but we're actually in a real classroom here, and this is what it really looks like. So Xyz Affair. Okay. Before we get to that, there's an undercurrent, meaning like a underlying mood that we really need to understand before we get into it. And that is the difference between, we'll say, sides A and side B. They're not A or B for any particular reason, just to differentiate them. This is, let's say, the anti-federalist side. And this is the federalist side. Anti-federalists are people who want smaller government. They are in favor of a Bill of Rights. I was going to say they're opposed to the Constitution, but that's not really fair to say. They were more nervous about it, apprehensive about it, and agreed to it only if there was a Bill of Rights. Side A, so this is large government, this is Constitution. Side A is also, although they don't seem to be related, it's just something I've noticed throughout the years, Side A happened to be pro-France, and Side B pro-England. And you may be saying to yourself, Mr. G, what does it matter? Why do these have anything to do with the things above them? And it's a good question. It's a fair question. It just seems to be the way things work. This is the side of Jefferson. And this is the side famously occupied by Hamilton. These two, this is 1780s, really. 1780s that they're really sort of getting going here. What's important to understand is that the Xyz Affair is 1797. So, 17 years or so later. But the idea that there were people high up in the US government who hated France or hated England was still very prominent. Jefferson was a lover of the French. He spoke French. He thought that French culture, French society was really, really renowned. he thought up until the Reign of Terror that the French Revolution was a really good thing because it advocated for individual rights and the rights of man and all these other things. Hamilton and others, on the other hand, were very pro-British. They were pro-bigger government. They were opposed to a lot of the things that the French Revolution stood for and a lot of the things that the Jeffersonian crowd stood for. So there's this underlying current. Again, anti-federalists, typically you want a smaller government. You're okay with states being really powerful. But you believe that government is more responsive when it's smaller and local, and so you want that power concentrated locally, not in some distant, far-off capital. Therefore, you support a Bill of Rights. You happen more times than not to be pro-French, and that's the crowd of Jefferson. And then the Federalists, they want a large government. They're in favor of a constitution. They tend to be pro-England. Okay, so we've got these two. All right, so with the Xyz Affair, what was going on was the U.S. and Great Britain had more or less made nice. They were not really fighting anymore. They were not really engaged in war anymore. And this is like mostly true because the War of 1812, which I'll let you guess when that occurred. The War of 1812 is a war between the United States and Great Britain. So, right up until 1797, they had gotten along amicably, but not real great. But what had happened was the U.S. and France had gotten salty, is what I'm going to say. They'd gotten kind of angry at each other. There's a variety of reasons for this. The biggest one is the French Revolution. The French Revolution created more or less a vacuum in the French government into which Napoleon ended up stepping and then sort of calming things down. But for a while, the French didn't know what direction they were going in. They had all different kinds of people ruling the country and then not ruling the country, and they were attacking this country, then they weren't attacking it. So it was very topsy-turvy. Okay, so the U.S. and France are not really getting along. And president at the time was John Adams. John Adams. And prior to him, Washington was president. Washington said England and France had been at war. There's a war called the Second 100 Years' War. And this term spans the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763 and the Napoleonic Wars, which is like 1800 to 1819 or so. France and England had been at war forever. And Washington had said that it's not in the best interest of the United States to get involved with either. So Washington put in place a Neutrality Proclamation. Basically said, we are a brand new country. If you think that we're getting involved in what you guys are doing, you are nuts. We're staying home. You can figure it out all you want, but we're staying out of it. Here comes President John Adams. Washington is more or less gone in terms of president. John Adams says, hey, France is really starting to upset us. They're doing a lot of things that we don't like. They're attacking our ships, all these other things. We're going to basically retaliate. Actually makes Washington his commander-in-chief of the military, again, which is very rare and shows how much respect and credibility people put into Washington's character. And he says, we're going to send 3 delegates over to France. A guy by the name of Pinckney, I think I'm spelling that right, guy by the name of Eldridge Gerry, and the most famous of all, John Marshall. 3 gentlemen. While there, they're going to talk to 3 people who are known later on as X, Y, and Z. So the United States and France not getting along at all. Things have gotten salty, even though we want to stay neutral. So Adams says, all right, so we're going to send 3 people over. we're going to send 3 people over and we're going to make nice. We're going to talk to the French and we're going to say, what are you guys doing? We really need to just sort of get along. We're such a young, new country that we can't afford major enemies at this point. So Pinckney, Gerry, and Marshall get there. And the foreign minister, or the minister in charge of foreign affairs, was the guy by the name of Prince Talleyrand. Very interesting gentleman. Just read a really good book on him. Very interesting gentleman. Seems to be considered to be very smart, like a really great diplomat. Fought and worked very hard for France, but complete fool when it came to this. So there's not really a great way of saying it. He's in charge of these 3 gentlemen. They're known as X, Y, and Z. He says, if you want to speak to me, you need to pay $250,000 to me. And France is kind of hard pressed after this revolution we just had. We need money, and we're fighting England. We want a $10 million loan. We want a $10 million loan. So this goes into my pocket, and this goes to France. Cool. So Pinckney, Gerry, and Marshall said, what? We don't do that. That's not what we're doing here. Turned them down. Eventually, what ends up happening is the Americans return home. In between that, Talleyrand and others say, okay, that's fine. We don't need the bribe. It's okay. Let's, you're already here. You've sailed all the way across the ocean to get here. The Americans say, no, we don't have time to play games. I don't know what you think you're doing. We're leaving. So they leave. Okay. So what happens when they get back is where this term comes from. Pinckney, Gerry, and Marshall relayed to John Adams, President Adams, what happened. Adams, who was, I had erased it, but Adams was a Federalist, i.e. pro-British and not a fan of the French. And his vice president was Jefferson. This is like, politics back then were so much more interesting. Imagine somebody gets elected who happens to get the most votes out of anyone, and then automatically the person who gets the second most votes becomes their vice president, and they have to work together, they have to get along. So interesting. So Adams, Federalist, pro-British, Jefferson, anti-Federalist, which means he's pro-French. Cool. So then Adams puts out to the American people, hey, France sucks. We don't like them. They're bribing us. We don't do bribes. And people rally around this. And that's where this term comes from, this phrase, millions for defense. We taxpayers will provide millions of dollars for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. And if you look back through history books, and all these guys were very well read, dictators, tyrants, rulers, from Xerxes, Darius, even Caesar and others, they always demand tribute. We have a bigger army than you. We are here. Give us money or you will be destroyed. That's what a tribute is. So what this bribe was linked to was essentially a tribute. And so these guys were seen as heroes. They were seen as heroes. And then what happened was, people were very much like, yeah, we're not giving France any money. But what happened was Jefferson and the pro-French crowd said, we don't believe you, Adams. We don't believe the French would do that. That doesn't sit with what we believe of them. So we don't think it actually went down that way. Adams says, and he's in a tough spot, the number 2 person in charge of the country does not believe the number 1 person in charge of the country publicly. What do you do? So Adams says, okay, well, the way that communication worked at the time was through diplomatic cables. And so you would relay information like on a Morse code or whatever, and then you would send it over a cable. It would be received by the other person who would then respond through this cable. This is how you manage to communicate without necessarily needing to be in front of each other all the time. Adam says, release the cables. Release the cables, like release the info. Release the info, but we're diplomats. Like, we want to get along with France at some point. We just don't like what they did here. Change the names of the people. Withhold the names. Call them, doesn't matter, X, Y, and Z. So that's what they did. So Adams releases the cables. Jefferson and the others say, we still don't believe you. That doesn't sit with the France. Now, mind you, when Washington was president, and a little bit before, Jefferson had lived in France. Ben Franklin had lived in England. A lot of these people had lived in Europe. This was a home to them for a while. So saying that France is now doing this is essentially saying people back where you are from are now doing this thing, and Jefferson saying, no, they're not. That's not who I know. So Jefferson starts getting very, very angry and starts having people put out things about Adams that Adams didn't like, things that Adams found problematic. And this led to perhaps the most unpopular piece of legislation ever, known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. There's not a great way to spin this. You could say that Adams was justified. You could say that Jefferson was justified. The Alien and Sedition Acts say that if you speak out against the government, we're going to arrest you. The problem is that flies right in the face of the First Amendment. The First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, meaning you can say whatever you want. Here's Adams saying, nope, not doing that, not anymore. That Bill of Rights thing lasted 10 years, not even. Alien and Sedition Acts are extremely unpopular. Jefferson undoes them. Extremely unpopular. But they were a response to what was happening at the time. So again, doesn't make them right, but that's where we get this from. So bringing this all back together, the Xyz Affair, what it was overall was a test. It was a test for the Americans, a test for their sovereignty, a test for their loyalty. Are they loyal to the American people? Are they loyal to an administration at the time? Are they loyal to a specific country in Europe? To whom are you loyal? And I think what the Xyz Affair showed more than anything was that by 1797, an American spirit had been formed, which was already something that the French couldn't comprehend. It was already something that the British couldn't compete with. The American spirit was born out of the idea that everybody ought to be able to rely on themselves, govern themselves, and have control over their own destiny. And these are all unique ideas, brand new ideas, at least when all put together. So this American spirit, 1797, this is less than a decade after the Bill of Rights is added to the United States Constitution. Less than a decade later, we already have an American spirit developed. Think of what's happened in the last 10 years in the United States or in any country. And in that same time period, you have a country with a brand new set of laws who's already so incorporated those sets of laws that they're willing to say to another country, a much stronger country in terms of military at the time, and while in that country, we don't owe you any bribe. So I think it's a really interesting test. I think it's a really interesting reflection of the American spirit. If you're watching this for any sort of test or anything like that. Xyz Affair is when France tried to extort money from American diplomats. American diplomats said, we're not paying you any money. And what it did is it resulted in the Alien and Sedition Acts ultimately happening, being passed, and led to further tension between France, pro-France and pro-English sides in the American government. This will lead to the nasty election of 1800, and it'll eventually lead to sort of separation of big parties around the 1820 time with the Henry Clay and the Andrew Jacksons. So I hope that helped. This is kind of a somber topic. And I think it's kind of somber for a couple of reasons. The big one is, at the time, and I keep coming back to this word test. At the time, this is a test because we had just made tentative peace. Tentative means very weak, very tightly held with Great Britain. Great Britain is England, Northern Ireland, Wales, maybe more, I'm not sure, but tentative peace with Great Britain. We have no allies that's not an S. No allies in Europe. I was thinking about Spain for a second. We have no allies in Europe. And we have just told France, no way. No money. It would have been far easier for the three diplomats from the United States to say, yeah, okay. If what you're saying is you're going to attack us if we don't do it, sure, we'll give you some money. But they didn't. And it's not because they were cocky. It's not because they necessarily hated France. I mean, these men were sent over there for a reason. Presumably you wouldn't send people who hate France over to France to make a peace treaty. You would send people who probably kind of like France, or at the very least are indifferent. Maybe they speak French. Maybe they studied French. We have a very weak peace with Great Britain. So weak that 1812, we go to war with them. Less than 20 years later, 15 years later. We have no allies in Europe. We are not allied with Russia. We are not allied with Austria or Prussia. Spain is in the United States, or I should say in North America. And the Louisiana Territory. Not American. So if this is the United States, this is the Mississippi River, this is our western border, this is not American. We're telling this country right here, nope, we're not doing it. We're not giving you any money. It would have been so much easier to do it. It would have been so much easier. Just buy us some time. Buy us 20 years. Let us get really strong. Let France and England destroy each other in Europe. We'll come back and we'll be better off for it. No. All because, I'm going to write it again, an American spirit was developing. It's probably not super academic to say that, but I think it's true. And it will lead to the era of good feelings. This is an AP question or topic. The era of good feelings, which is like 1820s or so. This is after we've beaten Great Britain twice. And I think what we're seeing with the XYZ affair is that it's already taking place. And that's really cool. Okay, if you like these videos, please click the like button, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'm not a big YouTuber. I'm a teacher trying to bring fun, engaging content to your screen. So if you like it, please do what you can to help this spread.